Mr. Sterling sat in a world he had built from silence and steel. His office was on the top floor of a building that owned its piece of the skyline, a dark glass tooth biting at the clouds. Inside, the silence was different. It was not empty. It was heavy. It was the silence of concluded arguments, of decisions from which there was no appeal. Sunlight, thin and pale, tried to cut through the tinted windows but gave up, pooling weakly on the deep grain of the mahogany desk. On the desk, there were no photos. No clutter. Only a leather-bound ledger, a heavy brass pen, and Mr. Sterling's hands. His hands were clean, the nails immaculate, but they looked as if they had been carved from old, hardwood. They were hands that had signed orders and shaken on deals, and, a long time ago, had done other things. Things that made the silence in the room so heavy. He was not a young man. His hair was the color of iron filings, thick and neat. His suit was dark, tailored so perfectly it seemed less like clothing and more like a second, more formal skin. He was reviewing the week's accounts, the neat columns of figures that represented the flow of his empire. Rents. Tributes. Percentages. The numbers were the quiet language of his power, and they spoke to him in clear, satisfactory tones. Outside this room, the city roared. Inside, there was only the whisper of paper as he turned a page. And the near-silent presence of Arthur. Arthur stood by the door. He was always by the door. For 12 years, Arthur had been Mr. Sterling's driver, his shadow. A tall, lean man with a face that gave nothing away. His eyes were a faded blue, like worn denim, and they saw everything and judged nothing. In 12 years, Arthur had never spoken a single word. Not a greeting. Not a confirmation. Not a sound. He communicated with a slight nod, a glance in the rearview mirror, the subtle pressure of the accelerator. He was perfect. He was a part of the silence. The intercom on the desk buzzed, a harsh, unwelcome noise. Mr. Sterling pressed the button, his finger moving with deliberate slowness. "What is it, Marcus?" Marcus was his lieutenant, a man whose voice usually carried the calm assurance of a subordinate who knew his place. Today, it was strained. "Sir. There is a woman here. She insists on seeing you." Sterling's brow did not furrow. His expression did not change. "I am not seeing anyone. I have told her that, sir. She will not leave." She slipped past the front desk. "An old woman. She's causing something of a scene." A scene was a violation. It was a crack in the perfect, controlled surface of his world. "Remove her, Marcus." "We're trying, sir. She's surprisingly strong. And she is crying. Crying." Another violation. Emotion was a currency he did not trade in. "Then remove her gently," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a low, cold hum. "And find out how she got past the front desk. The person responsible will be looking for new employment." He released the button. The silence returned. He looked back at the ledger, at the clean, predictable numbers. But the numbers were blurred now by the thought of the woman. An old woman. Crying. A few minutes passed. He expected to hear nothing more. Instead, he heard a commotion from the hallway. A muffled shout from Marcus. And then the heavy oak door to his office swung open. Marcus was there, his face flushed, his hand on the arm of a small, frail woman who looked as though she were made of bird bones and old lace. Her coat was threadbare. Her hair was a white cloud around a face etched with the kind of worry that becomes a permanent part of the skin. Her eyes, however, were not frail. They were fierce. They were fixed on him. "Please," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Please, you have to help me." Marcus looked mortified. "Sir, I am so sorry." She. Arthur, the silent driver, took a single, fluid step forward from his post by the wall. His movement was economical, predatory. He was ready to intervene, to become something other than a shadow. But Mr. Sterling raised his hand. A small, almost imperceptible gesture. But it stopped everything. It stopped Marcus from apologizing. It stopped Arthur in his tracks. The world paused, waiting on him. He looked at the old woman. He had seen desperation before. It was a common sight in his business. But this was different. This was not the desperation of greed or fear of consequence. This was the desperation of a soul that had been hollowed out. "Let her go, Marcus," Sterling said, his voice quiet. Marcus released her arm as if it were hot iron. The woman took a hesitant step into the room. She clutched a worn handbag to her chest like a shield. "They said you were a bad man," she said, her eyes not leaving his. "They said you did terrible things." "They are not wrong," Sterling replied, his tone flat. "But they also said you were a man of honor. That you have rules." "I do." "My name is Martha," she said, as if the name itself were a heavy burden. "I am not here for money. I am not here to beg for charity." She fumbled with the clasp on her handbag. Her fingers were gnarled with age. She pulled out a small, cassette tape player. The kind that had not been made in decades. It was scuffed and yellowed with age. "I am here to hire you," she said. She placed the tape player on the corner of his vast desk. It looked absurdly small, a relic from a forgotten world. "I want you to find the man who killed my son." Sterling stared at the plastic toy. He ran an organization that controlled shipping, construction, and the quiet transactions that happened in the city's shadows. He was not a private detective. He was not the police. "The police could not help you," he asked, a formality. "It was 30 years ago," she said, her voice cracking. "They stopped looking after the first year. Here's a cold case. A file in a box." She looked at him, and he saw the abyss in her eyes. The unending grief of a mother. "But he is not cold to me. He is burning. Every single day." Sterling felt an unfamiliar stirring. Irritation. Pity. He did not like either feeling. "I cannot help you, madam." "Please," she whispered. "Just listen. This is all I have left of him." She reached out a trembling finger and pressed the play button. A hiss of static filled the silent office. And then, a voice. A young man's voice, full of laughter. "Come on, Mom, blow out the candles. Make a wish." There was the sound of other people singing a ragged "Oh Happy Birthday." The voice spoke again. "Did you wish for me to finally clean my room? Because that's a wasted wish." More laughter. The sound was tinny, warped by time and cheap magnetic tape. But it was alive. It was the ghost of a happy moment. Sterling watched the old woman's face as she listened. Her eyes were closed. A single tear traced a path through the deep lines on her cheek. He was about to press stop, to end this intrusion. But then he saw it. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Arthur. The silent man. The unmovable man. Arthur had flinched. It was a small thing, a barely perceptible tightening of the muscles around his eyes, a slight jerk of his head. In any other man, it would have meant nothing. In Arthur, who had once stood perfectly still while a car backfired 3 feet from his head, it was a seismic event. Sterling's gaze shifted from the woman to his driver. Arthur's face was a mask again, but Sterling had seen the crack. He had seen the ghost in his own machine. The tape hissed to a stop. The silence that rushed back in was deeper, more profound than before. The old woman, Martha, looked at him, her eyes pleading. "His name was Daniel," she said. "He was a good boy. He disappeared in the fall of 1987. Sterling leaned forward. He did not look at Martha. He looked at Arthur. "Play it again," he said. "Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will redefine the meaning of loyalty and justice." If you are enjoying this story, please like this video and hit that subscribe button so you do not miss what is coming. And let us know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let us get back to it. Martha's hand trembled as she pressed the rewind button. The machine whirred, a small, mechanical scream. She pressed play. Again, the hiss. Again, the young man's voice, full of life. "Come on, Mom, blow out the candles. Make a wish." Sterling's eyes were locked on Arthur. This time, he was looking for the reaction. And he saw it again. A flicker in those faded blue eyes. A tension in the jaw. Arthur's hands, which always hung loosely at his sides, were clenched into tight fists. For 12 years, this man had been a fixture, a piece of reliable equipment. Silent. Unflappable. A man without a past. Sterling had hired him on a recommendation from an old associate. The file was thin. No family. No connections. He had appeared one day, a ghost looking for a purpose, and Sterling had given him one: drive, wait, and see nothing. And he had done it perfectly. He had driven through ambushes without panicking. He had waited outside meetings that decided the fates of men. He had seen things that would break a normal person and had never shown a flicker of response. Until now. Until this tinny, 30-year-old recording of a dead boy's voice. Mr. Sterling was a man who dealt in patterns. He saw them in the flow of money, in the ambitions of his rivals, in the loyalties of his men. His survival depended on seeing the pattern before anyone else. And this was a break in the pattern. A profound one. The tape ended again. Martha looked at him, her hope fading, replaced by the familiar resignation of defeat. "I'm sorry to have wasted your time," she mumbled, reaching for the tape player. "Leave it," Sterling said. The words were soft, but they landed with the weight of stone. Martha froze, her hand hovering over the desk. Sterling turned his attention to her fully for the first time. He saw the worn-out fabric of her coat. He saw the careful stitches where she had mended a tear near the cuff. He saw the quiet dignity in the way she held her shoulders, even when they were stooped with grief. She reminded him of his mother. He hated when things reminded him of his mother. His mother had been a woman of immense strength, a strength born of endless hardship. She had worked her fingers raw in a textile factory, her only hope a son she prayed would escape the life she was trapped in. He had not escaped. He had just built a better, more comfortable trap. He had rules. His first rule: no emotion in business. His second rule: no charity. Charity was weakness. It was a poison that rotted the foundations of an empire like his. You gave an inch, and they took a mile. You showed a crack, and they drove a wedge into it. But his oldest rule, the one he had made as a boy watching his mother cry from exhaustion, was unspoken. Protect the mothers. He had buried that rule under decades of pragmatism and violence. But this woman, with her fierce eyes and her broken heart, was digging it up. And then there was Arthur. The enigma in the corner. The loyal machine that had just shown a ghost. This was no longer about charity. This was a puzzle. And Mr. Sterling hated unsolved puzzles in his own house. "Tell me everything you know about your son's disappearance," he said. Hope flared in Martha's eyes, bright and painful. She began to speak, the words tumbling out, a story polished smooth by 30 years of telling it to herself in the dark. Daniel was a good boy. Worked at a warehouse down by the docks. He had started taking night classes at the community college. He wanted to be an accountant. He was not involved in anything bad. She was sure of it. One night, he went out with friends to celebrate a small promotion at work. He never came home. His car was found a week later, abandoned near the old shipyards. No signs of a struggle. No note. He had just vanished. The police said he probably just ran off, she said, her voice laced with old bitterness. Started a new life. But I know my Daniel. He would never have done that. Not without a word. He would never have left me. Sterling listened. He did not interrupt. He let her talk, his mind working, connecting dots that were not there yet. The docks. The shipyards. 1987, that was his territory, even then. He had been younger, hungrier. He had been consolidating his power, fighting a quiet, brutal war with the old guard who ran the waterfront. A man named Finch. Joseph Finch. A man of casual cruelty, with no code and no honor. A loose end Sterling had never quite managed to tie up. Finch had faded away after a particularly bloody series of disputes, rumored to have retired to a quiet life. Sterling knew better. Men like Finch did not retire. They just changed their hunting grounds. When Martha finished, the office was silent again. She looked exhausted, drained by the telling. Sterling steepled his fingers, his gaze distant. He was seeing a chessboard from 30 years ago. He was remembering the moves. He was thinking about a warehouse, a young man who wanted to be an accountant, and a ghost in his own car. He made a decision. It violated his rules. It was illogical. It was a distraction from the clean, profitable lines of his ledger. And he was going to do it anyway. "Marcus," he said, without taking his eyes off the old woman. "Sir. Take Mr. Martha home. Get her details. Ensure she has everything she needs. Food. Comforts. Everything." He paused. "And put 2 men outside her building. Discreetly. She is under my protection now." Marcus's eyes widened slightly. This was unheard of. But he was a good lieutenant. He did not question. He simply nodded. "Yes, sir." He gently guided the old woman, who was now weeping with a mixture of shock and relief, out of the office. The door clicked shut. Sterling and Arthur were alone. The silence between them was different now. It was charged. It was full of questions. Sterling rose from his chair and walked to the window. He looked down at the city, a sprawling map of his life's work. "You knew that voice, Arthur," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He turned. Arthur was standing in the exact same spot. But he looked different. There was a crack in his composure. A deep, troubled look in his faded blue eyes. He looked lost. For the first time in 12 years, Arthur looked like a man and not a machine. He opened his mouth. A dry, rasping sound came out. He closed it again. He shook his head, a small, frustrated gesture. "It is all right," Sterling said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "We will find the answers." He walked back to his desk and pressed the intercom button again. "Marcus. Forget what I said about Finch retiring. I want to know where he is. I want to know what he eats for breakfast. I want to know who tucks him in at night. Find him." "Sir." "Joseph Finch?" "It could take some time." "You have until sunrise," Sterling said, and released the button. He then made another call to a man who dealt in information, a librarian of the city's secrets. He gave him a name. Daniel. And a year. 1987. He asked for police reports, witness statements, rumors from the docks. Anything. Everything. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair. His neat, orderly world had been thrown into chaos by an old woman and a ghost on a cassette tape. Part of him, the cold, pragmatic part, was screaming that this was a mistake. But another part, the part that remembered his mother's tired hands and the boy who promised to protect her, was awake. It felt like breathing after holding his breath for a very long time. He looked at Arthur, who was staring at the small tape player on the desk as if it were a bomb. "Go get the car, Arthur," Sterling said softly. "We have work to do." Arthur nodded, his movement stiff, and left the room. The silence returned. But this time, it was listening. The hours before dawn were Mr. Sterling's time. The city slept, but its secrets were awake. Information trickled in, then flowed. Marcus, ever efficient, was the first to report. Joseph Finch was alive. He was living under a new name, Mr. Peterson, in a sprawling, fortified estate in the old horse country an hour north of the city. He had reinvented himself as a reclusive investor. He was rich, paranoid, and surrounded by private security. He had not retired. He had built a castle. The second call was from the archivist of secrets. The police file on Daniel's disappearance was thin, just as Martha had said. But the whispers from the docks, preserved like insects in amber, told a different story. In the fall of 1987, Finch's operation had been hit hard. A shipment had gone missing. A valuable one. Finch had been furious, convinced he had a rat in his organization. He had started tearing his own house apart looking for the traitor. People disappeared. It was a bloody, chaotic time. And Daniel, the boy who worked at the warehouse, the boy who wanted to be an accountant, had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had seen something he was not supposed to see. A meeting. An exchange. He had not understood what he was seeing, but Finch's paranoid men had seen him. A loose end. They had grabbed him. The story ended there. The Whispers did not know what had happened to the boy. They only knew that he was taken to one of Finch's properties, a place used for asking hard questions. He was never seen again. Sterling hung up the phone. The pieces were clicking into place. It was not a puzzle anymore. It was a map. A map that led from a grieving mother's heart, through 30 years of silence, and ended at the gates of a castle belonging to a man named Finch. He looked at the tape player on his desk. He pressed play. "Come on, Mom, blow out the candles." The cheerful voice echoed in the quiet room. He was not just a name in a file anymore. He was a boy laughing on his mother's birthday. Sterling called Marcus back. "Assemble a team. For men. The best. We are taking a drive to the country." "Sir?" "To Finch's estate." "Yes. It's a fortress, sir. His security is professional." "So are we, Marcus," Sterling said. "More so." He went downstairs. The car was waiting, a long black sedan that was as quiet and anonymous as the man who drove it. Arthur held the door open for him. His face was still a mask, but his eyes were fixed on Sterling, full of a question he could not voice. Sterling got in the back. "You're coming with me, Arthur," he said as the driver got behind the wheel. "All the way." Arthur did not nod. He just put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, into the sleeping city. The drive was silent. Sterling watched the city lights give way to the dark, winding roads of the countryside. He thought about the nature of his work. He was a monster to many. A villain in the stories people told to scare their children. But he had a code. You do not harm innocents. You do not bring the war to their doorsteps. You do not make mothers grieve for no reason. Finch had broken that code. He had extinguished a light for no reason other than his own paranoia. He had created a wound that had festered for 3 decades. This was not business. This was pest control. They met Marcus and the team at a discreet, pre-arranged spot a mile from Finch's estate. The men were dressed in dark, functional clothing. They were quiet, professional, their faces calm. They were the instruments of his will. Sterling laid out the plan. It was simple. It was direct. There would be no siege. There would be no frontal assault. They would go in quietly, like ghosts, and they would be having a conversation with Mr. Finch before his high-priced security even knew the perimeter had been breached. He gave his orders in a low, even tone. Every man knew his role. When he was finished, he looked at Arthur. "You stay with me. You are the key to this." Arthur's expression tightened, a flicker of something, fear, confusion, in his eyes. But he gave a single, sharp nod. They moved through the woods that bordered the estate. The night was dark, moonless. They were shadows among shadows. Finch security was good, but it was designed to stop a conventional attack. Cameras, motion sensors, patrols. They were looking for cars approaching the gate, for men with guns storming the walls. They were not looking for 5 ghosts slipping through a blind spot in the camera coverage, cutting a small, neat hole in a chain-link fence, and melting into the manicured gardens. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of silent, coordinated movement. They reached the house, a sprawling monument to bad taste and paranoia. Marcus and his team disabled the alarms on a side door with practiced ease. They were inside. The house was silent, filled with the hum of air conditioning and the faint ticking of a grandfather clock. They moved through the opulent rooms like wraiths. They found Finch in his study. He was an old man now, his hair thin and white, his face fleshy and soft. He was wearing a silk robe and drinking a glass of expensive brandy. He looked up from his book as 5 men materialized from the shadows of his own home. He did not panic. His hand moved slowly toward a panic button on his desk. "I would not do that, Joseph," Sterling said, stepping into the light. Finch's hand froze. Recognition dawned in his eyes, followed by a wave of pure terror. "Sterling," he breathed. "What is this? What do you want?" "I want to talk about 1987, Sterling said. The color drained from Finch's face. "I do not know what you are talking about." "I think you do," Sterling said. "I want to talk about a boy named Daniel. A warehouse worker. A boy who saw something he should not have seen." Finch's composure broke. He began to bluster, to deny. It was business. It was a long time ago. A loose end. "He was a boy," Sterling said, his voice dangerously soft. "And he had a mother." He took the small cassette player from his pocket and placed it on Finch's desk. "She is still waiting for him to come home." He pressed play. The young, laughing voice filled the study. "Come on, Mom, blow out the candles. Make a wish." Finch stared at the tape player, his face a mask of horror. He was not just seeing a rival. He was seeing a ghost. "What is this?" he stammered. "A shakedown? You bring a 30-year-old ghost to my house to scare me." "Not just to scare you, Joseph," Sterling said. "To remind you." He looked at Arthur, who had been standing silently in the shadows by the door. "Step forward, Arthur." Arthur moved into the light. He looked at Finch, and for the first time, there was an expression on his face. A deep, burning hatred. Finch looked at Arthur's face, at the faded blue eyes, the scar above his eyebrow. He saw nothing he recognized. "Who is this?" Finch sneered, trying to regain some control. "One of your thugs." Sterling looked at Arthur. "Speak," he commanded gently. "Tell him." Arthur's throat worked. He took a ragged breath. And for the first time in 12 years, he used his voice. It was hoarse, rough from disuse, like an old engine turning over. But it was clear. You told me you were going to let me go," he said. The voice. It was deeper now, scarred by time and trauma. But it was unmistakably the same voice from the tape. The cadence. The tone. The ghost was in the room. Finch's jaw dropped. He stared at Arthur, his mind refusing to process what his ears were hearing. "No," he whispered. "It cannot be. He's dead. We made sure." "You were not thorough enough, Joseph," Sterling said. Arthur, Daniel, took another step forward. Memories were flooding his eyes, a tsunami breaking through a dam that had held for decades. "You held my head under the water," he rasped, his voice gaining strength. "In the rain barrel. Behind the old cannery." He touched the scar above his eye. "Your ring. It cut me." Finch scrambled back in his chair, knocking over his glass of brandy. He was looking at a man he had killed 30 years ago. "They left me for dead," Daniel said, his voice shaking with the force of the returning memories. I do not remember everything. For years, nothing. Just silence." He looked at Sterling, a look of dawning, horrified understanding. "But I remember his face," he said, pointing a trembling finger at Finch. "And I remember her voice." He looked back at the tape player. "My mother." The story was complete. Daniel had survived. Beaten and left for dead, he had somehow crawled away. The trauma had shattered his memory, erased his identity, and locked his voice away in a prison of silence. He had become Arthur, a man with no past, perfectly suited for a life in the shadows. Until the sound of his own voice, and the memory of his mother's love, had found the key. Sterling looked at Finch, who was now just a pathetic, trembling old man. "You broke the rules, Joseph," he said. "You took a son from his mother. You left a wound in the world that never healed." He nodded to Marcus. "This business is concluded. Permanently." Marcus and his men moved in. Finch began to plead. Sterling turned his back. He put a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Let's go home, son," he said. The drive back to the city was different. The silence was gone. In its place was the sound of a man weeping. Daniel sat in the back with Sterling, his head in his hands, as 30 years of a life he had not lived came crashing down on him. He wept for the boy he had been, for the man he had never become, and for the mother who had never stopped looking for him. Sterling did not offer comfort. He just sat with him, a solid, unmovable presence in the storm of another man's soul. He was letting the poison out. When they reached the city, the first light of dawn was painting the sky in shades of grey and pink. They did not go back to Sterling's office. They drove to a quiet, modest neighborhood, to a small brick building with neatly kept flower boxes in the windows. The 2 men Sterling had posted were sitting in an unmarked car across the street. They nodded as Sterling's sedan pulled up. "Are you ready?" Sterling asked. Daniel looked up. His face was a wreck of tear tracks and exhaustion, but his eyes were clear. He nodded. They got out of the car. Sterling led the way to the front door of Martha's apartment. He did not knock. He waited. He stood back, giving Daniel the space he needed. Daniel raised a shaking hand and knocked on the door. They heard movement inside. The door opened a crack, held by a security chain. Martha's face appeared, her eyes wary. She saw Sterling first and her expression softened. Then she looked at the man standing beside him. She saw a stranger. A tall, haunted-looking man with faded blue eyes. There was something familiar about him, a ghost of a memory. But she did not recognize him. Disappointment clouded her face. She thought Sterling had brought her news, not a strange man to her door at dawn. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tired. Daniel opened his mouth. He struggled for a moment, the old silence fighting to reclaim him. Then he found the words. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking. Did you wish for me to clean my room?" The phrase hung in the air. The words from the tape. Martha's eyes widened. Her whole body went rigid. She stared at the man's face, truly seeing it for the first time. She saw the shape of his eyes. The curve of his mouth beneath the pain and the years. She saw her son. A sound escaped her, a choked, disbelieving sob. Her hands fumbled with the chain. It fell away. The door swung open. She stumbled forward, her arms outstretched. "Daniel," she whispered, as if the name were a prayer as she was afraid to speak too loudly. "My boy? Is it you?" He fell to his knees before her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "I'm home, Mom," he wept. "I'm home." Sterling watched as the mother held her son, her hand stroking his hair, her own tears falling freely. He watched as 30 years of grief and silence were washed away in a single, impossible moment. He had seen a lot of things in his life. He had seen violence and betrayal, greed and despair. But he had never seen anything like this. He had not just closed a loop. He had witnessed a resurrection. He turned and walked back to the car, leaving them to their reunion. He did not need to be there for that. His part was done. Later that day, Martha came to see him. Daniel was with her. He was wearing new clothes. He had shaved. He still looked haunted, but the emptiness in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, fragile light. They sat in his office, the same office where she had played the tape that had started it all. Martha tried to thank him. She tried to offer him her life savings, a pathetic bundle of cash she had brought in a paper bag. Sterling pushed it gently back across the desk. "You paid me already," he said, nodding toward the tape player, which still sat on the corner of his desk. "You brought me a puzzle I needed to solve." Martha looked at him, her eyes full of a question she did not know how to ask. "Are you a good man, Mr. Sterling?" she finally said. "Or a bad one?" Sterling looked at Daniel, at the son returned to his mother. He thought of Finch, of the quiet, permanent resolution in the countryside. He thought of the numbers in his ledger and the rules he had broken to make this happen. "I am what I need to be," he answered, his voice a low rumble. "Today, I got to be the man who brought your son home." He took out a simple white card and a pen. He wrote a phone number on it. His private line. He handed it to Daniel. "Your old life is over," he said. "Your new one begins now. If anyone, and I mean anyone, ever troubles you or your mother again, you call this number. You will never have to be afraid again." Daniel took the card. "I was your driver for 12 years, he said, his voice still rough but steady. "I do not know how to repay you for this." "You already have," Sterling said. "You reminded me of something I had forgotten." He did not say what it was. He did not need to. 5 years passed. The city changed. Buildings rose and fell. Power shifted in the shadows. But Mr. Sterling remained. He was older, his hair more silver than iron, but his authority was undiminished. His office was the same. The silence was the same. The heavy mahogany desk was the same. But there was one small change. On the wall behind his desk, where there had once been only bare, paneled wood, there was now a single, framed photograph. It was not a picture of a powerful man or a conquered rival. It was a picture taken in a small, sunny garden. An old woman, her face full of joy, was sitting in a chair. Standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, was a middle-aged man with faded blue eyes. He was smiling. It was a genuine, peaceful smile. The smile of a man who had found his way home. Daniel and Martha. Sterling had a new driver now, a young man who was efficient and respectful, and who spoke when spoken to. He was a good driver. But he was not Arthur. Sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet, Sterling would look at that photograph. He never visited them. He never called. The card with his number sat in a drawer in their house, an unspoken promise, a shield they would hopefully never need. He had given them back their lives, and in return, he had taken only this picture, a silent reminder. It reminded him that his world of ledgers and rules was not the only world. It reminded him that some debts are not paid with money, and some profits cannot be measured in numbers. The greatest strength is not found in the power to destroy, but in the will to protect. It is the quiet courage to stand for those who cannot stand for themselves, to be a voice for the silent and a light for those lost in the dark. For in the end, a man is not defined by the empire he builds, but by the single, fragile life he chooses to save.